Welcome everyone. This is a webinar called Photovoice in Action, a practical roadmap for elevating marginalized voices in rural areas. My name is Angela Morigi. I'm a researcher at the University of Padova at the Department of Land, Environment, Agriculture and Forestry. And this webinar was also prepared in collaboration with Laura Secco and Matilda Todesco of the same department. This webinar took place on January 28th, but the recording of the original live stream is not available, unfortunately. So I'm now recording a new version with the same content that was presented during the live stream, and I will also dedicate a final part to the questions that were asked by the participants during the webinar. Now I will start the presentation. This webinar is a dissemination and communication activity of the project VERV, a participatory action research project funded by the European Commission with a Marie Curie Individual Fellowship. VERV stands for Co-Creative Visioning Processes for Transformative Social Innovation in Rural Areas. It started in September 22 and it ended in January 25. And the case study is Belluno province in the Italian Northeastern Alps, where we conducted several participatory activities in different areas of the province over the span of 2.5 years. We had the support of local institutions with which we've been collaborating for a long time, the Fondazione Angelini Centro Studi sulla Montagna, a foundation on mountain studies, and the local action group GAL Prealpi and Dolomiti. My supervisor at the Department of TESAF is Professor Laura Secco, and I also collaborated closely with Professor Maria Tengo during the mobility period of the Marie Curie project at Wageningen University at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group. There will be 2 more webinars as part of the dissemination activities of the project, and they will both be focused on launching the toolkit, one of the outputs of the project, a toolkit called Imagining Vibrant Rural Mountain Futures, a field-tested toolkit of 25 co-creative methods. The first webinar will be for the English audience on February 12th, and the second webinar will be for the Italian audience, also launching the Italian version of the toolkit on February 27th. This webinar will follow this flow. Following this general information that I've now given, I'll introduce the results of the quick survey we carried out with the participants on last week during the live stream. I will then introduce Photovoice, the main information regarding the what, why, and how of this method. And then I will give a roadmap to a Photovoice project so that you have some practical information as to how to apply and implement this methodology using theory of change as a guiding framework. I will also cover some sensitive aspects related to the ethical issues, the data handling, etc. And then I will focus on the questions posed during the webinar and answer them. We asked during the webinar how many people of participants were from the academic sector or were affiliated to other sectors or were studying, and not everyone that was online participated. We had more than 50 participants, but many of them took this survey, and as you can see, we had lots of people from academia, quite many students, but also a few from other sectors. And we also asked them what inspired them of Photovoice, and you can see how creativity is a big aspect, as well as storytelling, the possibility to give voice to marginalized groups, inclusiveness, community engagement, distributed agency, the participatory, interactive, and personal aspects, the local knowledge, the visual and transformative features. Now, why, who, and how Photovoice? So, according to this definition given by Wang and Boris from one of the first papers published on the subject, Photovoice is a process by which people can identify, represent, and enhance their community through a specific photographic technique. It entrusts cameras to the hands of people to enable them to act as recorders and potential catalysts for change in their own communities. It uses the immediacy of the visual image to furnish evidence and to promote an effective participatory means of sharing expertise and knowledge. To say it in a rather easy way, for me, Photovoice is mostly a qualitative visual research method, often bringing to light dismissed or marginalized issues, and it's also a social engagement tool, giving voice to people's views and visions through the combination of pictures and short stories that they take themselves. The main objectives of a Photovoice project is to enable people to record and reflect their community strengths and concerns through the combined power of pictures and stories, to promote critical dialogue and knowledge about important issues through group discussions that are usually held after the pictures and stories are taken, but also before, to reach policymakers and also the wider community, and to promote social change at both individual and collective level. There are some examples that you can find online of Photovoice projects. There are many papers published, but practical examples where you can actually see a vast array of examples of the photos and of the pictures. And here I give some examples in Italian first and in English later. So here's an example of a Photovoice project carried out with students of psychology called Reframing Rome. It was a way for students to tell their perception of the city, how they experience the city as students living there. But it was also a way to reframe the students themselves as a resource for the city. And then here's another example of women who were out of the job market and were unemployed, unoccupied for a while. And the Photovoice was used as a method to enhance their self-awareness, their self-worth, and their capacity to see their capabilities and to see themselves in the job market again in the future. Here's another example of a paper you can find open access online, a paper from Ecology and Society written by Mastersons et al. And it's a project that was carried out in Africa in 2 different countries, and the authors describe the link between well-being and ecosystem services and landscape use through the results obtained through Photovoice. And then here we have another example. This is a book chapter, also open access, that you can find in this book edited by Franklin on co-creative methods. And in this chapter, my colleague Lorena Axinte discusses how Photovoice can be used with young people to gather their views on Cardiff city region. And she combined Photovoice with web mapping, so quite an interesting combination of 2 visual techniques. What are the key transformative features that for us were important in Verve and that made us decide to use Photovoice? First of all, the opportunity to give voice to individual and collective experiences with a qualitative approach. Then the possibility to an assets-based and generative approach, inspired also by appreciative inquiry, rather than starting from the gaps and problems like oftentimes we do in research. The possibility to give attention to marginalized, invisible, and vulnerable people, but also aspects, especially regarding rural areas. The possibility to enable social change and social learning. The possibility to enhance participation, critical thinking, deep reflection, deep listening, creative expression, and also to gather emotionally sensed knowledge. So the opportunity to give and highlight the importance of not just rational and intellectual knowledge, but also embodied, experiential, affective, and emotional knowledge. One important thing that for us was also very tied to the nature of the project is that taking photographs and writing stories is also a way to train another way of seeing. and observation based also on the ethics of care and on other research we've carried out as a deep ethical meaning. We are now living in an area of aesthetic consumerism, and we are constantly exposed to so many images that create dependence, but at the same time create a dismissal. We see so many times images of the war, of the climate crisis, of biodiversity loss, and sometimes we are so used to it we don't feel anything anymore. At the same time, we see the same images being constantly represented over and over and representing one version of reality, which then gets reinforced and its experience magnified. We also think of ourselves as photographers because we have a smartphone or we have some, sort of equipment that allows us to take photographs, but it's not actually that way. Photography is much more complex than that. So we think that seeing with new eyes and taking photographs can have also a different meaning if we do it in a certain way and with a different consciousness. We also are aware of the fact that photography and art in general can have a sublimation effect, because it can teach us to look with kinder and more attentive eyes at what is around us, but it can also sublimate suffering, the apparently insignificant, ugly, and that one would normally want to see. And these can have both positive or negative effects. This is a picture, for instance, by Edward Bertinsky, who's very famous for taking beautiful images of very severely degraded landscapes, and one could discuss the ethical implications of this. What are the three main dimensions that are usually asked with a Photovoice project? Usually the questions that are asked go from 3 to 5. You cannot really ask too many questions, because then people will produce an extraordinary amount of pictures and stories which are hard to handle and to discuss during the interactive part of the process. So 3 to 5 is usually a good number, and usually one asks positive aspects, so what people like, what makes them feel good, where they can find comfort and satisfactions in their context of where they are living or where they are temporarily embedded. Then you may also ask the negative aspects, what people don't like, what disturbs them, what makes them difficult for them to live there, and propositional aspects, what could be changed, how they could personally and at a community level support the change. Of course, this is just a very general guideline, but then you can ask many more questions along these lines or different than these ones. What I want to present today is examples from the VERV project, but I also thought it would be interesting to introduce some of the questions and answers we got from another Photovoice project I carried out in Finland with a group of mentally disabled people who were hosted and who were actually working and living in a care farm. A care farm is a place where nature and farm work is consciously used for well-being, social inclusion, and perhaps also educational purposes. And you can find more about this project in this report that I put here, Caring for People in Nature, and also in my PhD thesis. And I will now give you a few examples of how this project worked out and the kind of questions we asked there following the dimensions I just told in my previous slide. So, for instance, we asked these participants, what is the work activity that you like the most on the farm? And these respondents said, cooking is fun. The residents of the living unit do it together. We have a weekly list that shows the shifts. My favorite part in cooking is peeling the vegetables. It is the task that I like the most. What is an activity that you do not like particularly on the farm? I usually don't like tasks that don't match my education and all kinds of tiny work with hands. I find it less pleasant. It's difficult to come up with an example, but for example, one time we had to organize barbed wire that had gone messy. It was frustrating. It's also unpleasant if, for some reason, we don't have enough work to do. So you can see how these are rather descriptive captions of the pictures, but they also tell something of the individual preferences of these people and allow us to see disabled folks not as a monolithic group, but rather, as a group of diverse individuals. And so to also appreciate what sometimes is kind of given for granted, or what we don't see in the stereotypical vision of certain marginalized communities. Here is another example that we asked, what is your favorite place on the farm? And this person said, I walk down this road every morning to get to the farm. The view of the fields is very lovely. I see what happens in the fields. Sometimes I pick flowers. So this is my favorite spot. Another question was, what is your favorite moment during the day? And this guy wanted to be in the pictures. Most of the time, this is not something you do. But with this particular group, we decided to be flexible, and so to make it as pleasant and as close to the people's needs. And so we took a picture of him with a dog, when one of the pets in the farm, and he wrote, in the picture you can see Lisu, one of our dogs. In the morning he comes to greet us when we walk towards the sheep shed to start working, and that's my favorite moment during the day. Here is another example that comes from the VERV project, so a project where we engaged young people from 18 years old to 29 years old, with one exception of a person that was over 30. It was about 15 participants who took a lot of pictures and stories, and here you see one response to the question, what makes you feel at home? So a little bit of a different questions than the one we found, I presented before. And he answered, when I go towards the plains or towards the sea, I feel lost, almost a bit restless, because I begin to lose my reference points in the horizon. Neither the homogeneity of the plains nor the infinity of the sea soothes me. In fact, they unsettle me. But when I catch sight of the rugged horizon, the mountain peaks, then yes, I feel better. I feel enclosed, embraced, almost protected by the diversity of nature. I feel more at home. And he titled this image Mountain Ranges. Another example is the answer to the question, what do you find disturbing? And this person said, from sea to mountains. And she responded, the Dolomites and Venice, so different and yet so similar. Their wealth is also in part their downfall, mass tourism. Like a drug, they can't live without it, but it destroys their soul. Decisions are often made or not made in favor of visitors and their money, at the expense of the environment and the local inhabitants, who often choose to move elsewhere, taking their culture and traditions with them. And so these marvelous places overflowing with people end up empty. So you see how these pictures go a little bit beyond the descriptive level and are also very loaded, at least in this case, of critical thinking and deep reflectiveness. And in the previous example, you could see how the picture also, in a way, helped us understand the sense of place and the connection to place that this guy has. Now, a roadmap for your Photovoice project using theory of change. Before we go there, I just want to summarize the basic steps in a Photovoice process. So there is a very important preparatory stage, which should start very early, much in advance, because it's important to carefully define the topic, the objectives, the target group that you want to recruit, and to prepare all the materials and protocols, including the ethical protocols, the leaflet, the basic information, the evaluation form, and I will talk more about all these aspects in the roadmap. Then it's important to know that there is quite in a standard Photovoice project, there is quite a long implementation stage that should last at least 4 sessions, because you have a training session, usually, where, at least that's how I called it, but it can also just be an informative session where you introduce the objectives of the project, and where you have people perhaps introduce themselves, where you create an informal atmosphere, where you also give people an understanding of the topic that you want to treat and that you want to discuss throughout the process. and where you might also want to give some basic information and basic knowledge about this topic so that everyone has more or less a common understanding. Then you have 1 or 2 photographic sessions that where people go and take pictures and write the stories and captions on their own. Of course, there can also be variations where you do it with them or you do it in a collective way, but usually it's done individually. Then there is 1 or 2 sessions for group discussions where the pictures and stories become the subject of discussion and become a way to really raise controversial and important issues, and to perhaps also come up with proposals for changing, for creating some extra social action within the community. Then there is a phase dedicated to impact, where you might want to share the findings with the wider community and perhaps with policymakers, and where you might want to, there might be further social action guided by you or just initiated by the group of people. And of course, it's always important to evaluate the process, its effectiveness, and to understanding which way it was impactful. So if you see these basic steps, you get the idea that Photovoice is more than a method. It's actually a project within a project, and so it's quite time and resource consuming, both on your part but also on the part of participants. Okay, now going towards the roadmap. So I follow some of the steps of theory of change, or an adapted version of it, like context, purpose, inputs and resources, activities, outcomes, outputs, and impacts. So starting with context, you may want to ask at the beginning of the process, what are the main challenges and opportunities in the case study area? What are the needs and aspirations of possible stakeholders in the Photovoice process? And if you're carrying out this process for research purposes, then you may also want to ask what are the main research questions of the wider project, not just of the Photovoice part. In the case of rural Finland, as I said, it was also a rural area. It was a remote inner area, and I was studying an innovative entrepreneurial activity, which is green care, and I wanted to engage all sides of the story, because the main focus of my research were the practitioners, so the actual entrepreneurs and innovators who initiated and carried out the green care practices. But then I was actually thinking that it would be nice to also engage the disabled clients in one of the case studies I had. And so I thought Photovoice was the right way to do it. In the case of the Italian pre-Alps, so the VERF project, it was a marginal rural mountain area with socioeconomic fragility, where young people were not sufficiently engaged. So there was a need to engage these people more. And there was also an aspiration by local institution and a demand to engage young people in more creative ways, because there is a problem of retaining these people in these areas, especially due to depopulation phenomena. When it comes to purpose, it's really important why we are doing this process. What are the main objectives and goals, and what we want people to bring home as a result of the process, and what research questions we wish to address. That's an extra one. So in the case of rural Finland, we wanted to understand green care participants' perceptions of the place and of the practices that they were involved into, and we wanted to give them a voice. So we also wanted them to bring home something that was meaningful for them, was pleasant for them, and was not too tiring. And so I will explain later that we really adapted the standard steps of a Photovoice process. In the Italian pre-Alps, working with youth, we wanted to do something extra. We didn't just want to include and give voice to young people's concerns and aspirations about the socio-ecological system of their territory, but we also wanted to give them some input. So there was also a formative and educational aspect to the project. We wanted to question stereotypical images of the mountains. We wanted to break free of the binary understanding of humans versus nature. And we wanted to enhance the capacity to think in complex and critical terms about rural mountain areas and their landscapes. So to do that, we couldn't just go straight to the questions, what do you like of your context, what you don't like, and what you want to change. We had to introduce a preparatory step. So we had to ask them other questions before, or at least that's what we choose to do. And so we asked them a first round of questions, giving them some prompts that allowed them to see and to look around in a different way. For instance, I'll give you one example now. We asked one question: where do you see interdependence or disconnection in the socio-ecological system of your territory? So that they could look at things around them in a different way. And for instance, here you see an example. This person answered, there is no disconnection without interdependence. I thought this as I looked at the rope holding up a now removed rockfall barrier in an abandoned place. When we recognize the disconnection, we glimpse that interdependence which suddenly or gradually is broken. Perhaps the belief that there is man and nature is still too deeply rooted in me. These disconnections reminded that man must find his meaning in nature. Some say that man is nothing more than man in nature, still others that nature is not such if it does not include man. I don't know the answer, of course. I just want to be able to recognize the interdependencies without waiting. So you see how this person went a little bit philosophical and really explored very deep questions through the picture and the caption. And you also see how we structured the process so that people would take a picture, would also write a title, a caption or short story, and then would also tell us where they had taken the picture so that we could kind of have an indication of the geographical location where they did the shooting. Another thing you might want to consider very early in the process is what resources do you need at each step, and what budget needs to be allocated, and what do you have available. So you definitely need a lot of human resources. You may want to have a photo expert. People really appreciate the opportunity to be given some technical knowledge about photography, especially when it comes from it's about people who recruit voluntarily, and so not like in the Photovoice process we did with the mentally disabled people, where of course it was totally voluntary, but we had a very specific case with a group of people that were directly asked, do you want to participate? In the case of the VERF project, we distributed the call for participation very widely in the whole region, so there could be really anyone registering to the event. And many times in that case, people who sign up are also kind of passionate about photography. They might not be so expert, but they certainly like it a lot, so they appreciate the opportunity of a training in photography. Then you may want to consider having some assistance during the whole process, but especially during the workshops. So during the group discussions, you may need translators, like we did in Finland, for instance. We had a Finnish translator so that the participants could answer in their mother tongue, and actually Finnish or Swedish. And then we also had a mentor that knew very well the participants, the mentally disabled folks, and that could also help us understand some of the things they were saying in case they were not so verbally fluent. You might want to consider having an experienced facilitator for the workshops, and also a keynote speaker for the launch exhibition that may attract a wider audience. Then you need communication materials. This is, for instance, the flyer that we used to disseminate the information about the Photovoice lab in the rural mountain area of Belluno. You need workshop materials, you need exhibitions materials, which need to be printed, curated, and which are usually quite expensive to print. You need incentives for participation, voucher, awards, food that you offer during the group discussions. One of the awards we gave, for instance, to participants was some water bottles and some vouchers to go and buy some books at the local bookstores. You need digital devices like cameras if you're gonna, give them to participants, or they need to have it themselves. Of course, they can also use their smartphones. You need recorders for the group discussions if you wanna use this data for research. You need physical spaces, venues for rent, outdoor environments that are safe and appropriate for the photographic shooting in case you do it in a collective way, or in case you do the photographic session, the training session outside. You need online platforms to co-produce the knowledge. For instance, you need Google Forms or other ways to collect some basic data about participants, for instance, when they want to register, but also if you want to have some basic information about their age, their knowledge of certain issues that you want to discuss, or their previous involvement in the community. We also used a Padlet platform for people to upload the images and captions. In the case of the VERV project, you may want to start a WhatsApp group to have some swift communication during the process. And of course, you're going to have to use email communications as well for the official communications, or to send them the ethical protocols in advance so that they can view it and be totally conscious about what they get into. You need media support. You might want to engage with local newspapers to disseminate the news, the radio, and also to maybe spread the word about the results of the project. And you definitely need finances for all of this. And if you work in a public institution, you might want to mind the difficulty that sometimes are posed by bureaucratic and administrative aspects. Okay, regarding activities. What activities will you carry out during the process? How will you implement the Photovoice? How will you share the results? So in our case, we did definitely a few scoping activities. We interviewed some people who knew the kind of participants we wanted to engage. So in the case of the care farm, we had a little focus group with the initiators of the initiative and the mentors and the people who worked on a daily basis with the mentally disabled folks. So to discuss how to best implement the process, so to discuss the ethical aspects, the duration of the process, and all of that. In the case of the VER project, we interviewed some people who had experience working with youth in the area, so that we could be aware of the challenges and also opportunities in the area. We also carried out surveys, as I said before, to gather basic information about the participants. And of course, there was a lot of desk work, studying the case study area, understanding its issues, but also studying other kind of factors that have to do with the topic at hand. In the case of VER, for instance, the human-nature relations and the views on socio-ecological systems. Then we had some preparatory activities, scouting participants and communicating with them, as I said before. And then we had the participatory workshops. So in the case of VERV, we had 2 online workshops and 2 in-presence ones, plus 1 extra session that was not mandatory to prepare for the exhibition. And you can see the flyer of the exhibition here on the right side of the slides. We also allocated some time for the photographic action. We had 2 weeks for the first round of questions and 2 weeks for the second round of questions, and people went out and took pictures and captions on their own. In the case of the SUSPLACE project, so in Finland, there was no participatory workshop. The photographic session was carried out with the participants, so that we could help them take the pictures and tell us the caption right after. So we recorded their answers and then we wrote it down in these reports that we produced afterwards, very soon afterwards, so that participants could have a tangible output right after the photographic process. So the photographic process took place over a week. And we used walking interviews as a way to gather the information. And then the week after, the reports with all the pictures and stories were already ready and were given to the participants during a gathering session that we held at the care farm, outdoors around the fire with some food in a very intimate way, so that people could share what they had told us during the walk-in interviews and the pictures that they took with us, and then so that we could all talk about it and celebrate together, and so that the initiators of the initiatives could become aware of what was said and could use it also as a method, maybe in the future, to evaluate their activities. And in the case of Verve, it was different because we had different kinds of ways of discussing the pictures and stories. So we had workshops, and then we had the public exhibition that was launched during a very famous cultural event in the area. And then we had other the exhibition was traveling around the area for the next few months in different high schools. And here you see a picture of me talking to some high school students, where I brought the results of the exhibition, or I brought, some of the pictures and stories that were shown there. And I told them, what do you think about them? How do you relate to these topics? How do you relate to what these other young people told us? Although the age range was a bit different because the actual participants to the Photovoice lab were a bit older than the teenagers. And we had media articles, etc. And we also created some videos, and now this webinar. So here you see some pictures from the walk-in interviews with the case in Finland. And here you see some other techniques that we used during the workshops with the young people in Belluno province. You see some other somatic and experiential methods, like the thread of stories, the generative dialogue learning journey. And these methods are actually now described in the Verve toolkit, so you can find all of those in there. Here you can find some of the guidelines to give people when you discuss the pictures and stories that were taken. So you have, for instance, the photo method and the showed method. So describe your photo, what's happening, what does it tell us, what do you see, how does this program exist, what can we do about it? And then you also have some extra possible questions that we asked in Verve, like what strikes you about the pictures, who and what is missing from the pictures and stories, what are the recurrent or marginal themes. And then, of course, you can also ask, okay, what can we do about it in a practical way? Who could help? What resources are available in the community or could be further mobilized? About the outcomes, what outcomes do you foresee coming out of the process for the individuals, for the group as a collective, for the community, and how will you monitor and evaluate these outcomes? So in the case of Verve, we really wanted to provide a safe space for expression, for sharing and co-learning. We wanted to enable social learning. We wanted to activate social change. We wanted to build capacities and enhance competencies like, active listening and other transferable skills. We wanted to create meaningful connections, alliances, and networks that these people could rely on also beyond this process. And we use several evaluation techniques to understand whether the process had been effective and had been in line with our aspirations and with our intentions. For instance, we used a poster right at the end of the last session, so of the last workshop. We asked people if, they were satisfied with the process vis-a-vis the initial expectations. We asked whether the process had changed them. We asked them whether they felt they wanted to participate to similar activities in the future after taking part in this process. Then we also carried out an anonymous survey a few weeks after the process ended. And these are some of the results that we gathered. People said that they really appreciated the photographic techniques that were, taught during the workshops, and also the photographic coaching that was provided after the training session as well, commenting on the pictures and stories that they had not the stories, of course, because those are not photographic per se, but the pictures that they took. They also said that they appreciated the awareness that they gained about sustainability, regeneration, and some really complex issues that we touched upon. The opportunity to go home with new questions and not just with prefabricated answers that we gave them, because we didn't want that. We wanted them to really, train their critical thinking and go home with questions that they could answer for themselves. And then the possibility to gain new perspectives, to have an exchange and a dialogue around complex issues. And they also said that they appreciated the honesty, collaboration, intimacy, and trust that they found along the process, and the open mindset and lack of judgment that, according to them, we had as a team of researchers facilitating the process. They also told us that there was room for improvement. They would have wanted more time to take the pictures, more time in the workshops, more background knowledge, more outdoor sessions. During the survey, we also asked participants, of course I'm talking about VERV here, so the young people in their 20s that took voluntarily part to the process. We asked them whether the process had helped them to enhance a set of competencies which are part of this framework called the inner development goals. And competencies can be trust, co-creation skills, visioning ability, inner compass, empathy, different sorts of social skills, caring, etc., etc. So we got some very interesting answers as to how the process had helped them or not to enhance these competencies. When it comes to impacts, and I'm almost done with the roadmap, we also want to highlight the importance of monitoring impacts and evaluating them and being conscious about what kind of impacts you want the process to bring. Is it changing policies? Is it changing attitudes and behaviors? Is it changing narratives or in power structures? So that's something very important to ask. Also, being aware of the fact that there are very low impact rates, according to a review study by Darren Simons published in 2019, that says that half of the 32 studies of Photovoice they reviewed failed to bring information to decision makers and bridge between groups. Finally, what are the outputs that you foresee coming out of the process? Who do they target and for what purpose? So there can be exhibitions, there can be albums created, there can be an online site with all the pictures and stories, there can be scientific papers, reports, policy briefs, materials for a toolkit, like in our case. Here you see, for example, that one of the methods that is presented in our VERV toolkit is called generative dialogue with conversation starters. And these conversation starters are actually some postcards that we created using a selection of the pictures and stories that were taken by the participants in the Photovoice lab. So these, their pictures and stories can now serve as conversation starters to elicit a warm-up exercise where you ask other people, hey, pick a picture and a story and tell me, how do you relate to it? What does it tell about your rural mountain context? So, that's quite an interesting output, I think, that you can use to upscale the results of the project. And then you can create videos like we did. Here you see one example in the right, podcasts, webinars like this one. Here you see some of the pictures that, were created by the participants in the Photovoice lab and that we actually used as a way to create a flow of our public exhibition. And regarding sensitive aspects, and this is the very final part of my presentation, you need to be aware of the ethical procedures, of course, especially if you do Photovoice for research purposes. So you need an information sheet, an informed consent form approved by an ethical committee. You need to be compliant with the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU if you're, using this method in the EU, or with other relevant regulations depending on where you carry out your study. And here are some of the examples of the information that you may want to have in an information sheet: the title of the project, the objectives, the personal data treatment, the potential risks and benefits, the contact information, and then you have the informed consent forms, and you have different kinds of consents that you need to ask. You need to ask consent for people to participate in the process, consent to treat the data that are produced in the process, consent to take photos and pictures during the workshops, perhaps for documentation reasons, consent to disseminate the materials to the wider public, and how that is to be done. Is it to be done with a nickname? So are you going to disseminate the pictures and stories with the nickname or with the original name, and And then, of course, you may want to have a consent if people wish to take pictures of other human beings that are identifiable. So in our cases, we preferred not to do that. So we asked people to take pictures of human beings only if the faces were not or other features did not make the person identifiable. But if it's so, you need an extra informed consent that the person taking the picture and writing the story need to ask to the person they take the picture of and they write the story about. And all these ethical procedures are important for scientific integrity, for making sure you publish your papers and you don't encounter any hiccups in the process of publishing, and also because you may need them as a project deliverable. In our case in Verve, the ethical protocol was a project deliverable. Okay, what you produce out of a Photovoice project, of course, is not just data. And it's important to remind yourself that when you analyze the data, you may want to triangulate the images with the written captions, with the verbal explanations given by participants during the group discussions, so that you can avoid misinterpreting the data, so that you can be more rigorous in interpreting different data sets, so that you can mitigate the risks of deference and social desirability. So the idea that people respond in a way that they think is appropriate in a social environment, or they respond in the way that they think you want them to respond. So they tell you what they think you want to hear as a researcher. And in general, you may want to triangulate to increase validity and robustness of the findings. Of course, what comes out of the process, the pictures and stories, are very useful for communication and dissemination purposes, because they are a great resource for presentational knowledge, and they can also be boundary objects that facilitate the discussion and understanding of complex issues. And one last thing I want to say, remember that there are sometimes moments where you want to prioritize process over outcome, and where you want to put the process aims first and not the research aims first, because the two don't always go hand in hand. So it's important to find a balance and to make sure that the process is meaningful for people, even when perhaps some steps are not so useful for the research. At the end of the day, should you use Photovoice or not? So there are advantages: rich data, transfer of power from researchers to participants, new voices, perspective shifts on complex issues. It's flexible, it's fun, it's creative, it's engaging, it creates powerful outputs, it can lead to capacity building and social learning, etc., etc. You may also have disadvantages. Scarce participation, for instance, was a problem in the project carried out by Lorena, and she explains in her beautiful chapter that I talked about earlier about the youth in the Cardiff City region. The results may be banal, you may have ethical issues, it's very time and resource consuming, the data can be difficult to analyze, and the images can be, misinterpreted. Which other problems do you see? Well, there can be many, so I leave it to you to think about those. At the end of the day, I think an effective Photovoice project has to be tailored to the kind of people and topic you're, having at hand, and it has to be flexible. because you need to be flexible in time, in the technology you use, in the level of co-design and co-creation, and in the level of independence that you leave to participants versus the guidance that you want to afford. What I think, I hope comes out of this presentation and also of the answers to the questions to the participants to the live stream, which I'm gonna give in a moment, is an increased understanding of what is Photovoice, why it's used, with whom and how, specific insights into different ways of designing and implementing a Photovoice project, understanding of how to combine Photovoice with other participatory techniques, a practical roadmap to carry out the Photovoice project in the most effective way, stronger awareness of sensitive issues when using Photovoice and how to deal with them. All right, here are some of the key references on Photovoice. Here are some other references which I added after last week live stream. Here are some references on the Photovoice case that is presented. Here are some other references on visual and creative photo methodologies which you can use to go hand in hand with Photovoice during the workshops. Now, the Q&A session. So I will now go over the questions that were asked by the participants to the original webinar. Here is question 1. Is Photovoice the same as photo elicitation? No, it's not the same. Photo elicitation is when you have pictures and you may also have some text, but usually it's mainly images that you give to participants to talk and elicit a conversation about something. So it's not pictures and stories that they necessarily took. Since you have 1 or 2 shots, how do you decide the good questions to be asked? Well, it really depends on the purpose of your project. It depends on the kind of participants you have. I hope that the examples I gave in the presentation give you an idea that it all really depends, and there are no good questions. The important thing is that the questions are clear, and sometimes participants may you may also want to give some general questions, some very broad questions, and see what themes come up, and then refine the conversation based on the themes that come up. Is there an optimum number of participants to use Photovoice with? Yes, I think according to the literature, there is an optimum number. Usually it's no more than 20 people, because it again gets really hard to handle such a big amount of pictures and stories. And so it's important to have a small group. In the VERV project, we had 15 participants that took part to all the sessions. This was for us a requirement. So when people registered to the Google form to sign up for the process, we told them, hey, these are the dates and times and venues where the process will take place. If you can participate to a list 3 out of 4, please register. If not, please do not, and we will leave the space to people who can guarantee a continuous participation, because we really wanted to create a safe space and a critical mass, and you cannot do that if you have people coming in and out of the process. In the case of the Finnish Photovoice process, we had, I think, a little bit less participants, around 10. And I think that's also a good number, especially if you want to carry out very deep group discussions. 8 to 10 people are actually more than enough. Do you know any projects that used it in the aftermath of earthquakes or other environmental events? Yes, I found some papers after the end of the original webinar, and I put them in the literature, so you can find them there. Do you ask the same question to all of your respondents throughout your research project? Yes, because then you can use the answers to generate a collective discussion. So it's important that the questions are the same. What other ways you can do Photovoice when your participants don't have cameras and you have a limited budget and can't give them disposable cameras? Well, I think disposable cameras are also very unsustainable, so I would not advise using them. But in general, you can find very, creative ways. In the case of Finland, for instance, people didn't necessarily have cameras or couldn't even use them. So we used a a Padlet, like a small computer where you could see the screen very broad and take the picture directly on the screen, pushing a button. So it was also a way for the participants to, we could go around, decide together the frame that they wanted to have their picture taken in, and then they could press it. So we could also help them with in case they were not able to physically to do it themselves. So that's one way to do it. And in the literature, I'm sure you can find other creative ways. The caption is done immediately after or during taking the picture, or is there a time for reflection? As I said, in Finland, we had people telling us the description right after, but then we also went back to them. We showed them the pictures and stories, and we said, are you happy with the caption? Are you happy with the picture? Do you want to add something? So that they could also reflect on it. In the case of Belluno province, people had time to reflect because they had 2 weeks to take the pictures and to write the captions themselves. So, they had all the time they wanted to write and rewrite the same caption. Normally, is the person taking the picture the one adding a sentence or an explanation? Yes, of course. Is the caption or story that accompanies the photos that then shared with all participants, or is the discussion generated more on a one-to-one level? Yes, usually they are shared with all participants because they become the subject of the group discussion, and you can then decide how you want to have the discussion, whether you want to have one-to-one conversations, you want to have small groups, you want to have plenary discussions. We had a little bit of everything. We combined group discussions with plenary discussions. So we did it in different ways because we wanted to have a very dynamic process. So there are different ways of doing it. But everyone could read and see pictures and stories of everyone else because they were all uploaded on these Padlet platforms well in advance, like 2 or 3 days before the workshops, and then they stayed there only for the group of people participating to the Photovoice project so that they could really have an idea of what others said. How does a Photovoice group discussion differ from a focus group discussion? Is there any difference in qualitative data deriving from the discussion? I think a focus group discussion usually involves an homogeneous group of people, homogeneous in terms of age or gender or expertise. And usually a focus group is meant to discuss a very focused issue and to delve into that issue. So I'm not sure Photovoice is really a kind of focus group discussion. Also, a focus group discussion usually involves 6 to 8, maximum 10 people, doesn't go beyond that. So in our case, I think our group discussions were really workshops. Our workshops were, combining different techniques beyond the discussion. So yeah, they were not focus groups per se, and I wouldn't say that the group were homogeneous. Yes, okay, they were all in their 20s, but they were both women and guys, and there was also a lot of diversity in the basic knowledge about the topic at hand and about photography. And actually, it was also including people who did not live in that moment in the area, but who knew the area very, very well and wanted to move there in the future. So also in that sense, I wouldn't call it a focus group. The qualitative data, of course, is different because I think in a workshop you get, if you use different techniques, you get a more diverse set of data. So yeah, if you do thematic analysis of the results afterwards, do you invite participants to review the results of the analysis before finalizing them? Well, I think that would be very nice. I think that would allow for, validating your results, but also for extra reflections to come up. So if you can, if you have the time, and if the participants are available and are not, too burdened by all these things that we ask them, yes, do it. If not, I think you have a lot of data already coming out of the process and also perhaps of the exhibition. If a caption is wrong, meaning that, for example, it describes the photo and not tell the story, is it right saying that it's wrong and needs to be phrased? I don't think there is any wrong or right for this kind of techniques and for this kind of contributions by participants. However, if you think that participants didn't get what you asked and are totally off topic or didn't really respect the way you asked them to tell the picture and story, then, for instance, you wanted them to write a caption that would at least be 3 sentences long and they just write the title, then of course I think it's really needed that you tell them, hey, could you actually follow the instructions so that we could have a more, comparable set of findings. So yeah, I think you can do it, but I wouldn't say it's wrong. If, on the other hand, participants answer in ways that do not center necessarily what you want, but still, respond in other ways, and you have the opportunity to ask many questions so that, you don't have just to rely on that, then I think it's okay to just leave it as it is. But I think you get the sense of it when you do it. And then you also understand whether it's appropriate to intervene or not. Do you have observers while having the discussions, in a sense, like listening to their perceptions, the observers are influenced too? No, I don't think observers are a good idea. I think it's important to ask participants to be fully engaged. And so everyone should take at least, out of 5, they should take at least 1 picture and story, if not more. Because I think it creates a safe environment if everyone participates actively. Of course, then they can have a more active role during the discussions, they're more passive one, that's totally fine. But I think it's important that everyone contributes with some pictures and stories. When a participant is sharing their description of the image, there are people that share picture, but but they're also engaged in the discussions. So I think this was maybe a follow-up to the first question that I already answered. Going to the next question, I'm curious how to frame the photographic exercise well. Many participants, in my experience, automatically take picture in a way that would take it in social media platforms. Yes, of course, that's a risk, and that's also something I kind of touched upon at the beginning when I was talking about the ethics of seeing and this aesthetic consumerism that we're all very used to. I think you can give examples of how a story can be written and what kind of pictures could enrich the process. Not necessarily, you can give examples, and you can also, in my case in Verve, I took a picture and I wrote a short story so that people could get the idea that you could do it in a descriptive way, but you can also do it in a more symbolic and philosophical way. What about the copyrights for dissemination purposes? Is that obtained through a consent form only? Yes, as I said before, you can ask for consent in a written way, and you can also ask people in which way they want the data to be disseminated in the case that it's not for scientific purposes, because in the case of the exhibition, for instance, in our case, it was very local, and people wanted their name to be associated with the picture and captions in some cases. So we did that. We add their names next to the pictures. But then, of course, we will share the results in an anonymous way for scientific purposes. And some people didn't want their names to be associated with their pictures. They wanted to be a nickname to be written. How did you recruit participants? So as I said before, in the case of Verve, we had a flyer distributed everywhere we could on social media platforms, in the newsletters of our project partners and local collaborators, in youth organizations, newsletters, through word of mouth, in WhatsApp, whatever means possible, the media, the radio, etc. in the university also platforms. I would be interested to have some feedback from you. Can I find it somewhere published? No, not in our case. The feedback is the one I presented before that we gathered during the survey. We will share more feedback during in our scientific papers, but they are not published yet. Another set of questions. Can you elaborate a bit more about Photovoice and the difficulty in transforming results into recommendations for policymakers? So it's not easy to transform the results into recommendations. I think one way to do it is to really triangulate these very rich qualitative data, which is very niche because it's very tied to a specific context, to the wider picture, by reviewing the relevant literature, by adding information that comes from other studies. So by really gaining a sense of what comes out from the Photovoice project, also in relation to the wider picture and the wider knowledge. And I added some papers regarding Photovoice and the results to the policy arena in the references. What are the key ethical considerations? Well, I think I talked about them before. And I think another issue that you may want to consider is to which extent you want to be, just hosting a process or also intervening more strongly as a researcher. I give you a practical example. Some of the pictures and stories that were taken by our Photovoice Lab participants were not totally scientifically accurate, but we decided that we didn't want to say that out loud and just go in a very paternalistic way to, teach something to people as researchers. We allowed the conversations to flow and the discussion to just, revolve around those issues in an open way. And then some other participants said, hey, I actually think perhaps it's not really like that, but we didn't want to intervene heavily in that way during the group discussions. And I think that's an ethical concern that you might want to take into account. In what ways did the networks formed through the Photovoice project continue to thrive, if that was the case? And do you know of any groups which continue to meet to discuss similar themes they explored? Well, in our case, I don't think the networks continued so strongly, and I don't think the people continue to meet to discuss similar themes, but I know of cases in which this has happened, especially with groups that really shared stronger bonds, like in the case of cancer survivors or other groups. And so I think that's a very nice opportunity. In our case, we still have a WhatsApp group where we share relevant events and information, and some of the participants kept meeting after the process ended, also to go and hike and spend time in nature together. But I'm not aware whether they continued to work together, or to discuss these things together. We also had one of the participants of the Photovoice Lab doing an internship with us at our department, because she became quite passionate about facilitation techniques and creative methods. In my project, it won't be possible to conduct workshops with participants after they submit the pictures. Am I considering using the photos and captions as prompts for follow-up interviews? I think of it as mixing Photovoice and photo assistation. Do you have any thoughts? Do you think it can work? Well, definitely it could be a very nice process. And it's actually, as I said, very rich to use pictures and stories in an interview to elicit a conversation. I think what you might want to consider is the ethical aspect, so that the people who contribute with pictures and stories are aware that those information are going to be used in interviews with other people or with themselves as well. So that's something to take into account. And I also think you might not want to call this Photovoice, because I think the group feature, the group element is really important, and the critical mass creation is really important in Photovoice. So I would call it maybe, photo elicitation. The final set of questions is, there is so high emphasis on Photovoice being a democratic process, which is an issue as I'm doing my research in a socialist country. During fieldwork, a local officer participation is also mandated and similar to the presence of policymakers. In one of your examples, this can cause a bit of power situation. What would you advise? Has there been any prominent Photovoice research or project done in similar context that you know about? Or should I just drop Photovoice as a tool? So what I answered in the stream, in the live stream, is that it's not so easy perhaps to use Photovoice with policymakers because, yes, of power issues that may occur. What I think is important is to really be conscious and transparent whether these people are happy to engage in such a process, whether they want to use this methodology, and not if they're forced to, because this is really something that people do because they want to, because they really want to engage, they want to participate, they want to learn something, they want to meet other people, they want to grow, and so yeah, that's an important thing to take into account. Secondly, I'm not totally aware of other examples, but I added some references in the reference list, so you can have a look. And also, should you drop it? Yeah, it depends. It depends, as I said, whether you think these people might appreciate such a technique, whether you think it might yield the results that you want, and they might want to be fully engaged because it takes time and effort, or whether you may want to adapt the process in a shorter span of time, like we did in Finland. And also, whether it's going to be fun for you and, engaging for you as a facilitator, yeah, slash researcher. And you may also want to do a little bit of a trial, maybe run a mock Photovoice with one person so that you can see how that policymaker reacts to it. Have you heard about this done with the administrators, staff, decision makers? Well, I just said I'm not fully aware, but I added some references, and yeah, this is something to take into account, and I think it could be so enriching in such contexts as well as in research contexts, because I think it would really shift our perspectives on things and allow us to see things from a different perspective. Also, when it comes to knowledge that we give for granted and that we think we know so well about. Is there any interest being among either these communities in organizing further Photovoice style workshops themselves? I am not aware of that. I know that in Finland, the green care practitioners said, and they told that in a video that you can also find online called Nature as Pathway, they said that they were going to use Photovoice again as an evaluating method with their green care patients or participants. And I know that participants in our Photovoice lab in Belluno province took part to other similar projects. I also know that other researchers who came to our exhibition and saw our results decided to do photographic based research projects in the area. So, there have been some spillover effects. I have a few questions on the exhibitions. You mentioned that you also included a traveling Photovoice exhibition to schools. Were there Photovoice participants present for this? And if not, how did you authentically represent their views? Well, I invited everyone to come to the schools if they wanted, but they couldn't come or they didn't want to come, so I went on my own. And the idea was not to really represent their views. The idea was to use their contributions as a segue for other discussions and as a way for people to tell their stories in a way that would be personal for them, but starting from another person's point of view. So how do you relate to that? What does it tell you? What does it tell about you? So the main point was not to really represent these views, because the views also represent themselves. People read stories and read and see the pictures and interpret them in their own way, and it's not for us to represent them necessarily, but they travel on their own. If and how have you used exhibitions as site for inquiry by gathering feedback from the audience, and how have they interpreted, impacted by the photos and stories, and if this has led to any change? Okay, yes, there was a part of the exhibition where people could contribute with comments, with then their pictures that they could take and then print and put in this area of the exhibition. And we gathered feedback and other information, but of course not many participated, so I don't know whether it was the most effective way to do it. You could also have a book left there for people to write their messages and how they liked the exhibition and what struck them. Or you could have discussion sessions if that's something possible for you with the time and audience that you have available. And they've been impacted. Well, that's hard to trace the impact, and that's hard to say whether this led to any change. I can certainly say that every time I go also to the university, for instance, to master students, bachelor students, doctoral students, and other university colleagues, and I present the result of the project and I show the pictures and stories, people are always very impacted on a personal level and they always find it very insightful. So that's what I can say at this point in the process. Okay, here are some of the comments that were left in the chat by the participants to the webinar. And I just share them here because I really want to thank everyone again who came to the live stream and contributed with their questions and actively participated and, dedicated some time to these projects and to this very interesting method. So thanks again to everyone. Here are my contact details. If you want to ask more questions and stay in touch, please do so. Thank you again for watching this video. I hope it was useful. Goodbye.